as you talk to people, if there are not a significant number of naysayers, I think you might want to double check if this is really innovative. Innovation, by definition, comes in the face of conventional wisdom. So if you go out and talk to some really smart people who are conventional wisdom, and they're like, yeah, that makes sense, you should do that, it might not be as innovative as you thought, and there might not be a huge opportunity there. The biggest opportunities, and now from the investor side, I have a deeper perspective of this, the things that are hard to do, the things that people believe are impossible or improbable or going to take way too long, the entrepreneurs and companies that prove those people wrong are the ones that are very well rewarded.
Hundreds of thousands of researchers around the world are working to improve life and address imminent threats to humanity. Often their research ends up in the scientific valley of death in the form of publications and patents that never see the light of day. That is about to change. Welcome to the Lab to Startup podcast, hosted by Naresh Sunkara, founder and executive director of the Berkeley Postdoc Entrepreneurship Program at the University of California, Berkeley. This show has two main goals: share the stories of those who have successfully founded startups based on their own research, and highlight resources needed to help those aspiring to launch startups in the deep tech space. Whether it's electric cars, vaccines, addressing climate change concerns, or possibly establishing life on other planets, Naresh and his esteemed guests want to help scientists, engineers, faculty, and researchers bring their innovations to market. Learn more and subscribe today at labtostartup.com. And now, here's Naresh.
My guest today is Caleb Bell. He's a very special guest because he's an entrepreneur turned investor across a wide range of fields, both as a founder and investor. He founded Bell Biosystems, a biotech startup that focused on developing tools for tracking and imaging of cellular therapies right out of his Ph.D. at Stanford. He then went on to become an investor at a variety of financial institutions, ranging from private equity to venture capital firms and everything in between. He is currently a venture partner at Corundum Systems Biology and also the president of Corundum Convergence Institute. We talk about a variety of topics about his startup Bell Biosystems, about how they were able to work at various labs around the country with very little money, building teams, culture, raising money, interacting with investors, leadership transitions, and also have the company filed for bankruptcy, although after he left the startup. Caleb agreed to dip into his experiences both as a founder and investor and talk about each of these topics, which I believe will be very helpful for aspiring or current founders out there. It was an absolute blast talking to Caleb, and I hope you find this useful as well. All right, Caleb. I'm super excited to talk to you today, especially because you're one of the very few guests on the show to have gone through the transition from a grad student to a founder and then an investor. I'm hoping to cover a lot of ground about your experiences in these three roles.
Absolutely. Happy to be here. And thank you very much for having me. I'm honored and privileged to be talking to you today.
Great. I was doing some research on you and found that you've always been an entrepreneur at heart. You ran a restaurant in Delhi business and then an event festival, production and promotion company. Maybe we can start there because you seem to have the genes, and then we can transition to other phases of your life.
And even before that, when I was in middle school, I made little buttons and bracelets and stuff and sold them. It has definitely been in my genes. And then later in life, I realized that I wasn't really employable in other ways. So it became a requirement. In order for me to have a job, I had to create the organization.
Great. I think I found that I'm unemployable almost at the end of my postdoc career, but it seems to be a trend among entrepreneurs. Well, I think that's a nice segue to talk about your grad school student training. You went to Stanford. Maybe you can shed some light on the training itself. Are there any aspects of your training that helped you become an entrepreneur?
There were, and it was impressive. And maybe I'll just come a little back if you don't mind.
Yes. Yeah.
My path to Stanford, as you'd notice, I'd gone right out of college and I opened a restaurant. That failed. And that failure was a little formative. And when I was younger, I realized I needed to get an education because you need some basis of things. And in college, I found science and biochemistry in particular. And then I had the opportunity, lucky enough, to get out to Stanford for grad school. I was CEO of a company I'd founded at the time. So I stepped down and gave one of my business partners took over the role. And I was headed to Stanford with the naive opinion of I was just going to be an academic from there on. My career is a little unique in that I was a founder CEO, then went to grad student, and then out of grad school became founder CEO. My path is a little unique in that sense. I'd already run a company and stuff before there. But the training at Stanford, both the formal training that my Ph.D. advisor and through my graduate studies, and then also I was part of the Stanford Institute for Entrepreneurship, the summer program. I got a mini MBA there. And then just the resources in the community that's around you were incredibly informative and helped train me in a number of ways to become a better entrepreneur as well. One big learning for me, and back in high school and early in my career, I was not a terribly good student. So one of the big lessons getting to Stanford for me was incredibly humbling. I was very lucky to be there and realized just how amazing and smart so many other people are. And that put a lot of things in context. And it also, I don't know if you've been to the Stanford campus, but it's like a resort. And I felt very just privileged to be there. So everything was bonus from there on out.
I have some amazing friends at Stanford, get to hear a lot of inside stories. And like you said, the ecosystem where you're growing up, it's just not being stuck in a lab. I think that is so important in terms of your thought process and evolution. You're not just isolated like most grad students are in other schools. Well, if you then decide to go back, let's talk about your parents. What was that looking like in terms of your different roles as entrepreneurs? Have they been entrepreneurial as well?
Not so much. And then my parents got divorced at a very early age. I was about 6, and I didn't see my father from then until I was 17. But one thing that really helped me as an entrepreneur, my mother, after her divorce with 3 kids, single mother, went and became a lawyer. So she went to law school. And then for some of my first companies, she was my corporate attorney. A lot of people have a bit of a disdain for lawyers. And I think there's a lot of lawyers that you don't like, and there's a lot of media. But if you're building a company, really having the support of some amazing attorneys is hugely value enhancing. And the way you interact or talk with or how you navigate the legal side of things is definitely a learning and different than what you would expect in other ways. And having my mother being a corporate and then an SEC attorney really gave me an unfair advantage in many ways of being able to access and navigate that side of the business.
Wow. I hope you got some discounts in the billing rates. Good reason to love
She
your...
was very expensive.
Maybe we'll double click on the subject of interacting with lawyers. Like I said, they looked at with disdain. I think it mostly comes from the billing and fear of talking to them. Any lessons learned or any message to founders about the best ways to interact with these attorneys?
There's a couple ones. And I think Hollywood has provided some of the disdain. And I think if you get good attorneys, it's completely improperly focused. Good attorneys can make or break your business, and good attorneys are worth their weight in gold. You often get what you pay for with legal advice. So a couple things, and I think about things, I separate between IP and non-IP.
The corporate side of it.
And on the corporate side, if you go to some of the big shops, those partners, you may look at the hourly and be like, oh my God, how much are these people going to bill me for? And if you go with the little smaller solo gun shop, they're much lower hourly rate. But the big shop, they've probably seen and done 99% on the corporate side of what you're going to do for your first 5 years. So while the hourly rate may be higher, that partner is probably going to go into their vault, take out something that he's worked on or know works and change 5 words in it for your company. It will take him a fraction of the time to do it. Whereas a solo gun or a smaller shop, they may be writing that and developing that new each time for you. And so the cost to you is hours times rate. And it could be either zero sum gain or in some cases more expensive. So my advice is for the corporate, find a big shop, go with a big shop. And usually it's going to be more economical for you. And it's also signals well that you're able to bring in those big shops. There's a confidence that what's going to be done is done well. And you can usually get a deferral for them up until a financing. On the intellectual property side, I have a very different opinion. And on IP, you are taking your technical scientific innovations and working with a lawyer to create a patent, and it is unique, it is individual, and there's very little room to screw up. If you mess up your patents at the beginning, that could be fatal flaw. If you mess up an advisory agreement at the beginning, you can fix that. And so what you're looking for with your patent attorney is this Vulcan mind meld, where they're finishing your sentences. They really understand what you're trying to do, what you're getting after, where the technology is moving. And for the IP side of things, I think less on what company they're with, what firm they're with, what their rate is this the right marriage? Because if that IP attorney understands what you're doing and gets it, they can really support you. And if they don't, and if they're just billing and trying to process some patents, they could be potentially fatal to your company and business.
That is great advice. I think we can jump into your startup journey now. Let's talk about Bell Biosystems. What problem are you solving at Bell Biosystems, and talk about the inspiration to start one there?
I'll talk about the inspiration first. And it was just like any good graduate student at Stanford, I was listening to NPR a lot and reading some other books. So the inspiration, it was about 2 a.m. on New Year's Eve, and I was on my way home. And the car, whoever was driving, I don't remember, but we were listening to NPR, and it was Science Friday. And they were talking about this technology that had come out of MIT called the cellular backpack. And they're talking about how they could basically attach this scaffold to the outside of a cell. And now you could put a payload in that cell. And it was so amazing. It was going to change everything, particularly in regenerative medicine and cell therapy. And I've been super interested in regenerative medicine and cell therapy for a lot of reasons. And listening to this thing, and what they put in there were these magnets. So they magnetized the cell, and my Ph.D. was really focusing on magnetism in nature. So I was also interested in that. And then they said, oh, and we have a YouTube video. So when I got dropped off at home, I was like, oh, I got to find this YouTube video. And I looked it up, and there's no video here. So it's going to be hard. But if you think of the cell as the size of a quarter or something, the cellular backpack, the scaffold that they put on it, it was almost the same size. And in a Petri dish, they're moving it around and zigging it. And I was like, wow, that's really cool in a Petri dish. There's zero chance that'll work in vivo. You have this big epitope just hanging on the outside of the cell that's going to elicit an immune response. How's that going to go through tissue? And the book that I was reading at the time, just for shits and giggles, was about mitochondria and the endosymbiotic origin of the mitochondria. So a business, if you want some new functionality in a business, you either build it internally or you acquire it. Nature works the same way. If the cell wants some new functionality, you either build it internally through mutation or some arrangement of your genes, or in the eukaryotic cell case, you can acquire it through endosymbiosis. And this resulted in the mitochondria and the chloroplast. And I thought that was cool. And my undergrad, I'd worked on extremophiles, these weird, unique bacteria. And I happened to know about this bacteria called the magnetotactic bacteria that make these little nanomagnets. And at night, in my mildly or potentially very intoxicated state, I said, oh my gosh, you don't need to put it on the outside. You want to put it on the inside. We want to create a magnetic organelle internally to the cell. And guess what? Nature already created this building block for us. We just follow what nature did with the mitochondria and the chloroplast. But we use this magnetotactic bacteria. I scribbled that down on a piece of paper and I went to bed. The next day or the next week, I woke up and I was looking at it and I thought it was a decent idea. I'd often scribble down ideas and go to bed. This was nothing new, but I struggled to get this one out of my head. And then I started digging. And what really cemented this in my brain was when you look at the endosymbiotically derived organelles and endosymbiotes, if you look at deep sea creatures and insects, there's hundreds of examples of these things. Where nature takes these from on the evolutionary tree of life for the prokaryote is not random. They're selected from the same branch of the tree. And lo and behold, the magnetotactic bacteria was also on that branch. And that just lit up for me. And maybe it was a bit of a naive assumption of like, oh, we'll be able to take 20, 30, 50,000 years of evolution, and we can do it in a petri dish in a reasonable time scale. And I was stuck on this idea. I just couldn't. It was my fourth year of my Ph.D. I'd done most of the work for my thesis, and I just really couldn't get this idea out of my head. But at that time, my suspicion was that this won't work. There's no way this will work. And how do I do the experiment to figure out this won't work so that my brain will shut up and let me move on with life? Because at this point, my brain was just stuck on this. And I was in my fourth year of my PhD. So one obvious thought was, I'll do a postdoc. So I started looking around, and the PhD lab that I was in, we didn't have any of the equipment. We couldn't culture a stem cell. We couldn't even culture the bacteria. So I was like, where's the place that I would go for a postdoc that would have the equipment that would let me do this, that I could figure out that this experiment's going to fail and then move on with my life? So I was talking to my PhD advisor and I was talking to my undergrad research advisor, the one that had worked on extremophiles. And they both very politely let me know that you don't do a postdoc on your idea. You go do a postdoc on somebody else's idea. So what I would need to do is go do a postdoc, deliver on those things, and then convince that postdoc advisor to let me do my own thing. And that seemed really slow. And I wanted to fail this quickly. So then we came around to the idea of, well, let's fund a company. San Francisco Bay Area. How hard could this be? We'll raise some money. We'll fund a company. We'll get into the lab that we need. We'll access these resources. We'll fail it quick, and then we'll move on with our life. And at this point, my brother was in business school at the time, and he was about to graduate, and he was looking for what he wanted to do. And he and I had been kicking this around for a while. So we ended up co-founding the entity. We raised an entirety of $50,000, a chunk of it from my PhD advisor at the time, and a chunk of it from my brother and I, our poor college and graduate student life savings, and some other investors this is beyond crazy money at the time, because this was literally idea on a piece of paper, no more. And a little bit of naivety, because $50,000 is not really enough to do much. We weren't going to move into a lab space or anything. But what we were able to do is we were able to convince 3 different labs in the country that had all of the pieces of the puzzle that we needed to try this out, to let us come in for free. One of those labs was my undergrad research advisor. So I moved back to Pennsylvania, lived in his house for a bit of time, used his lab and cultured these bacteria, did some genetic engineering steps that we thought were there, and then had a stem cell lab in the Bay Area that would let me come in and culture some stem cells and work with it. And then we also connected with the Jackson lab in Bar Harbor, Maine. And working through all this, the proof of concept experiment that we had devised was based on the assumption that, look, we need to get these bacteria inside the cell somehow. And working with some stem cells, that wasn't easy. You don't just mix them together and it gets in. So the Jackson lab could do microinjection. So we're like, okay, we'll go into an embryo and we'll microinject. So we'll take this introduction step off the table, and most probably the cells will die or the cells will kill the bacteria. That's what'll happen. We're not going to get an organelle out of this off the first bat. So we GFP labeled the bacteria, and a little bit before Thanksgiving, I fly out, and all of these labs are basically doing this for free for us. The Jackson lab, we paid a very modest amount of money, a very, very modest. Our biggest line item expense in the first year was my flights back and forth to do all this stuff. So we go to the Jackson lab, we have the microinjection set up and the team's helping us do it. We inject 100 and some embryos with GFP labeled bugs, and we went into the 2-cell stage so that we could tell internal control. 1 cell was a control for every experiment. And then we injected them and we come back the next day. And for the first time ever in my experimental career, an experiment actually worked the first time we did it, which was super lucky because we didn't have enough money to do it twice. Come back in the next day and they're at about the 8-cell stage. And oh my gosh, half of the cells are GFP positive and half of the cells are not. And then come back the next day and boom, later stage embryo, half positive, half not. And we haven't had crazy attrition of, we're not killing off these embryos. They're continuing to develop. We fast forward 4 or 5 days and now I'm accustomed to it. I come in the morning, let's look at the images, see how they're doing. And they're like, Caleb, we have a problem. I'm like, what do you mean? They're like, we didn't think there was any chance this experiment would work. And at this point, you either need to implant these embryos into surrogates, or you need to start the stem cell, the derivation procedures, none of which we were prepared for. And tomorrow's Thanksgiving. So we're like, okay, look, this is a great experiment, already far exceeded our expectations. Let's call it a day. Happy Thanksgiving. And with that experiment that we did once, that we had no money to do more than once, that for whatever luck worked the first time, we were able to raise 1.5 million seed funding. And then we tried it again and it failed. And then we tried it again and it failed. And then we tried it again and it worked. And then we tried it again and it worked. But at that point, we had a little bit of money that would allow us some wiggle room to stand it up. And now the team was 4 people. Nobody had a salary still, but we were off to the races.
Fascinating. And I'll take a step back here. So when you're going around all these labs around the country, were you already a startup at that point or were you incorporated?
We had incorporated. Remember, my mother was a corporate attorney. So yeah, we incorporated pretty quick. We had some patents in place. We did have that stuff ironed out.
Okay. And what were your first conversations like? Who did you talk to in terms of, I had this idea, I want to start a company. Did you get any feedback? What was that like?
We got a lot of feedback. Most of that feedback was, this is crazy. Why are you doing that? But some people were like, oh, interesting. That's cool. That's a smart idea. My Ph.D. advisor, who ended up being one of my first angel investors, spent months trying to talk me out of this, but then realized it was stuck in my brain and I was doing it. And I actually think, back to something you mentioned earlier, what's some advice or stuff out to the entrepreneurs or potential innovators out there? As you talk to people, if there are not a significant number of naysayers, I think you might want to double check if this is really innovative. Innovation, by definition, comes in the face of conventional wisdom. So if you go out and talk to some really smart people who are conventional wisdom, and they're like, yeah, that makes sense. You should do that. It might not be as innovative as you thought, and there might not be a huge opportunity there. The biggest opportunities, and now from the investor side, I have a deeper perspective of this. The things that are hard to do, the things that people believe are impossible or improbable or going to take way too long, The entrepreneurs and companies that prove those people wrong are the ones that are very well rewarded. That is where innovation comes from. So I think when you go out, you want a level of, are you crazy? There's no way this will work. Now there's a balance there. At some point, your perpetual motion engine and disobeying the laws of nature, that might really not work out.
Now, that is great advice. And I think that's a common theme my other guests have been saying. You need enough naysayers and you need that determination to probably prove them wrong. Well, the next topic should be about the markets. You're the scientist in love with your science. What was the market hypothesis in your mind? What did you think you're going to make this and how were you going to make money? If you had a hypothesis, and how did you convince the investors with that hypothesis?
We did, and the hypothesis of it was pretty clear to me, and I definitely fell in love with the technology, but I simultaneously fell in love with the problem. And there's sometimes a psychological trap if you fall in love with the technology and not the problem. You end up a hammer looking for nails. As I mentioned a little earlier, I was very interested in the stem cell space and regenerative medicine. And the problem that many people had articulated before, after you transplant these cells, where do they go? And if you're trying to regrow brain tissue and the cells you transplant all go to the liver, it doesn't matter how many billions of dollars were sunk into that or how many Nobel Prizes came out of it. There's zero chance the patient gets better. And there was this big void in cell tracking. And this was the whole inspiration and why even thinking the magnetic organelle, putting that magnetic label on that cell would enable you to track them using magnetic techniques. Now, some people may say, oh, GFP label or put luciferase in. That's fine for a mouse. No problem. But when you get above a mouse, that's impossible. And you genetically engineered. And MRI has a really good safety profile. There's no tissue limitations. It's what you want to do, but you need a label that has high fidelity and is true to the cell. So the problem was there. We can touch on this later. We realized there were some perverse incentives in the market. Some people acknowledged the problem, but didn't want to pay for a solution. Some other people in the field really did. Depending upon the indication or area, we had either easy or hard adoption. So back to the investors, it was articulating that problem. It was bringing a good team together. And across all of the companies I've done, my hiring strategy is really simple. Get people smarter than me and get out of their way. And then as the team grows, get people smarter than us and get out of their way. That gets challenging, but if you're able to do that, that's where you build a really good team and a really good culture. And so we had a couple guys at the beginning that were just fantastic. And it was off the team, the opportunity, and then it was a pretty unique technological approach that we were able to explain simply. And that's what really helped us get those first investors in.
Well, how did you get those people to work for you who are more intelligent than you and better than you? What worked?
Hiring and getting people is always a big challenge. And you also need the right type of people. So startup folks, you want people that are harvest minded. If you're looking to hire people to your team and the first things that they're caring about or focused on is what is their base salary, that may not be the right type of person. If the first thing they're focused and pushing on is how much their equity is, that's probably the right person, or at least the right mindset. And you got to look at other things. So we talked with a lot of people and we offer people that are challenging, offer them a challenge, especially when it's a technical side. Again, we've done this across a couple entities. When you look at what you think you need right away, you say, well, I think I need expertise X, but your startup X is going to evolve. So what we actually looked for is we think we need expertise X. Let's find somebody in Y that's good at Y and come and say, hey, you're really good at Y. I want you to come do X. X is next to Y. So I think you can move into it and you give people a challenge. And at least my experience, a lot of these early folks, you want them, hey, here's the vision. Here's what we're building. Here's the equity that you'll be able to get to. And here's the big challenge that we're after. Here's the thing that a bunch of people think is impossible, but we think is possible. And we want your help making it possible. So I think recruiting those people, being open and offering them a challenge is a way to bring them in.
Recruiting is really hard, I think, at least from my experiences. Were there any mistakes that you made or any lessons that others can avoid?
We've made mistakes, and I'd say bringing the wrong people in or incentivizing them wrong is a mistake. And the biggest mistake I'd say that I did across that is being too slow to rectify it. And it magnifies as your team gets bigger. When it's you and 2 or 3 people, everybody's in one camp. Everybody knows what everybody else is doing, and that's fine. As your company expands, you as the founder or the CEO, which was the role I've usually been in, you start getting further and further distanced from the people. By the time a problem comes to your desk, it's a lot bigger, and it's been going on a lot longer than you really know about. And often some people have tried to fix it themselves, and the way it comes to you is not completely accurate. It's one side of the story, and there's other sides of the story, and how you deal with that is really critical because it impacts the culture, it impacts the performance, it impacts your whole team, and you don't do these things in a vacuum. Others are watching. And as I'm sure many of your other podcasters have said, culture is critical to a startup. And there's at least 2 parts to that, building that culture. You can sit there and write this beautiful document of this is the culture we're going to have, and this is what we're after. And you can have your weekly meetings and espouse the missions and the virtues and the values. And that's very important. Equally important is the lowest bar you will tolerate. And that sets the culture just as well. This is an easy example. This is not something that we've done ever before, but if you want everybody to be in by 9 a.m., and that is your culture, and I'm personally not a time person, so it's not one, but this is just a very easy example. And if there's one person that for whatever reason, you tolerate them coming in at 9:30, 3 days out of the week, that sets the bar. So even if your outward thing is everybody should be here at 9 a.m., because you're not enforcing that, you're really setting a culture of coming in at 9:30 is okay. And maybe that's what you want. But the whole point here and the advice is the easy part is writing down the virtues and the values and what we're after. The hard part is when there's something that's not going right, going in there and making a change or having the conversations or setting it on the path to bring it back. And that's difficult, but that also sets your culture equally, if not more, than the virtues you write on paper.
That's an important observation, I think. But what worked? If setting a culture is easy, as a founder, do you go in and change that to fit that 9:30 person, or do you let them go?
This is the hardest part. I've employed hundreds of people over my career across a number of organizations. And at some point, you often will have to let people go. In my mind, there's 2 types of sins, for lack of a better word, with the air quotes. There's the cardinal sin. I was in the restaurant business and we have cameras on stuff. And we noticed yesterday you were stealing from the bar. You were no longer employed here. That is a cardinal sin. I had another situation where, hey, you physically assaulted another employee. You're done now. Those are very clear. And those are actually
easier ones, I think.
They're easy and they're rare. And in those cases, I think you need to make that correction a little bit publicly because this is not tolerated. This will never be tolerated. And that's it. But those are the rarities. The more common ones are where it's like, hey, our expectation is you're in at 9 and you're really in at 9:30, or you're constantly late on these milestones, or there's some other more performance issues. These are harder. I think these you need to do more privately. And the way I like to do it, and every organization has their own thing, is just bubble it up. and escalate it. And first, we'll have the breadcrumbs, little conversations of just trying to hint at it and get there and see if people will take that. Then escalate it to a verbal conversation where it's explicitly, this is the bar that we want. This is where you are. And I will usually ask, what do you need from me? What are we not providing you? What is going on in your life? Because there may be something else that you're not seeing that's contributing to that, and it's outside of actual performance. And your goal should be to fix that. If it's back again to this thing, you're showing up at 9:30 every morning because you're dropping a kid off at school and you're a single parent. Well, then, you know what? Guess what? Show up at 9:30. Let's remove the problems on me for not understanding there's other things in your life. So I think you need to spend a little bit of time to dig into those things. If that's still not working and you give people a reasonable amount of time after the verbal conversation where it is very clear, this is a performance challenge, then you take it up to a written one, the PIP, the performance improvement plan of here's what it is, and you get them to sign off on it and give some reasonable amount of time. And if that still doesn't work, well, then let's figure out a transition.
Thank you for diving in deep into this, because I don't think anybody teaches you as a founder that at some point you need to become a manager. And grad school doesn't teach you, or most startup schools don't teach you this. That's why I engage in these conversations, because you can bring your experiences and have a framework for people who are going down this path. Thank you for sharing your experience in this. Let's go back to the train of thought. You raised about $1.5 million. Take us through the journey from there.
Before we go back to that, could I just make one more point on this one? Because there is a journey also, and the way your job as a founder is to build the culture and build the organization and hire the best people and monitor and manage them. You go through cycles, and you yourself need to change the way you're doing it. So at the very beginning of founding a company, you are a doer managing doers. It's a flat organization. We're all in the trenches together and we're doing it. When you get a little further along, you're no longer in the trenches, and now you're managing doers. I'm going to tell you what to do, and we're not going to do it together because I'm going to be off trying to raise money or something else. When you get a little further, you have a layer in between you, and you start now managing managers who are managing doers. And the way you are managing them, what you are monitoring, and how you're dealing with these things changes. And then when you get even a little further, you are managing managers of doers, and it ever increases. There are those three stages, and the way you monitor, the way you manage, the way you deal with those things needs to change. And if you yourself don't adapt and evolve along that axis, you need to hire somebody in that can.
That's a nice framework, and it's almost like a test check if you're evolving before an investor comes and tries to fire you as a CEO, which we hear happens in about 50% of the companies, it seems. There's some recent statistic I pulled out. Thank you for that plug-in. Let's go back to the journey. After you raised $1.5 million, how did that journey continue?
This was another interesting lesson. We raised that money and we promised basically 3 milestones, just A, B, and C for argument's sake. We went a bit of the ways through A, and then we realized that B was stupid. We thought a year ago that B was a smart thing to do, but now given what we had learned through half of A, B was not valuable. So how do you go? But I'd made promises to the investors. We're going to do A, B, and C. And now I want to come back and say, I want to do A and C because I realized B was stupid. And there's a little bit of a psychological hit. How do you deal with that? Or could we just do B and then figure out B's stupid? And no, we didn't go that path. We went back and talked to our lead investor and basically said, now 6 months into A, we think B is stupid. We want to revise. And the investors were sophisticated and they're like, thank you for telling us that. That's great. What are you going to do instead? Where's D? So now you're going to do A and C, but now what's some D? And we worked with them on that. That was really good to set up a longer term relationship. Those investors continue to back us because the investor founder relationship is one built of trust. And what they read out of that, and I didn't know it at the time, but now being on the investor side for a while is, oh, you are going to be a good steward of this money. You're not just going to spend it on stuff just so that you can say, I checked the boxes, I'm done. Let's go on to the next one, that you're actually trying to build the company in a logical and capitally efficient manner. So that helped. And then we continued to fundraise and we wrote some grants. We got a couple grants, and the product was called the magnetic organelle. And the value prop is we can put it in these stem cells and then we can track and see where those stem cells go. So after we did a little bit of that engineering and were able to get it into some cells and show it, then we went in vivo and can we track, or in principle, we thought we could also control. That turned out not to work. That was B. We thought we could control where the cells go, and we realized pretty early on we couldn't. So we did that. And then a big, I'd say, milestone is this works in our hands. We think this is cool. Let's find some external parties that might be a little more critical if it doesn't, and see if they think it's cool. Let's see if they think it works. So we started building some external collaborations and some external programs. We did alpha testing. There was some interest. We got some alpha testers were using it well. Sorry, a little sidetrack, but one of the things that I found was very, very useful, and this ties back into something you were saying, we had in our minds, everybody on the planet should track their cells in every situation and every type and everywhere. But that's not how markets really work. There's some people that like it and some people that don't. And as we were looking towards our Series A and where are we going to put a lot of development effort, how do we pick? We can think cardiovascular applications. We can think neuro applications. We can think developmental biology applications. We can think T cells. We can think all these things. So when we switched from alpha to beta testing, we were pretty deliberate in it. And let's get a couple testers in all of these potential buckets that we think, and basically let the market decide where we're getting the most feedback, the most pull, the most bang for our buck, and not ourselves think of where we think the best outcome is. And that was really useful. And there seemed to be, in some cases, there was a fair amount of value and we got more pull than we had capacity. So we started charging for these people to be our beta testers. And it was more of we thought it was, hey, how do we figure out if they're really interested? And just a validation, but it drove a little revenue in, and our investors were really happy that we're getting a little bit of revenue in the door. And that helped us figure out, as we've gone from this base platform technology, where are the indications, where are the areas of the market where it's most valuable? And that gave us a little finger in the wind or some help to figure that out. And then we doubled down in the next round and let's really build out the application teams. And it turned out that neuro and cardiovascular and not T cell were where the technology had the most uptake.
Is it fair to label your company as a biotools company? You're helping moving these magnetic cells?
It was absolutely biotools, although we had some therapeutic dreams and applications, but we were building the tool first to develop a little bit. And then we wanted to collaborate with folks and build the technologies and some more therapeutic applications.
And then you pick up something important. You talked about selling your product in the beta testing phase. It's pretty bold, I think, because most scientists are scared of selling anything or putting a price on that. Can you walk me through the process of what you had in your mind in terms of what the pricing should be? Or were you scared that you cannot ask for money because it might or might not be successful?
We had a lot of internal debate about that, particularly with the scientists. And I gave you my background at the beginning of this. And I think I was a little different in that I'd been an entrepreneur before. And fundamentally, a business sells something. And if you build something and nobody will pay for it, that is not a business. So to us, figuring that out earlier rather than later is hugely valuable. But yes, the scientists in our team we can't do this. We don't know. How can we charge? And my brother and I were just steadfast that, look, let's see what it is. And we tried to inch our way there. So before we started asking folks to put a price tag on these things, we did some surveys. And surveys are always challenging because if you ask somebody how much they'll pay for something, they're always going to tell you a number lower than the reality. When you do those surveys, how you ask the questions, or that stuff all matters. But that's a real true measure of if this thing has some legs. And trying to find that out early is really valuable. It was hard. There was some people that pushed back, but we had enough interest that we could get paying beta customers.
That's an important lesson. I don't know if there is one or two lessons for the founders at this point. Yes, thinking about money is important, but about the pricing point of view, what have you seen work the best of pricing our tools? You can stick to that for the time being.
Well, and one thing that I would say, coming back to one of your earlier questions also, what did my Ph.D. teach me that helped me in entrepreneurship? Treat everything as an experiment, and price discovery is an experiment. You can ask the question and get that experiment and figure it out, and then iterate or change if you need to. So as we were going out in this, we had the way we're doing our sales pitch, the order, the stuff we're trying to do, testing. And this is not original. We didn't come up with this. There's all sorts of books and stuff on how to do A/B testing and price discovery and stuff like that. But I think bringing that technical, analytical, experimental mind to it was valuable. We took that approach. The other thing I would say that we learned through this, there's psychology associated with this, and scientists all believe they don't succumb to marketing.
They believe in logic.
And that's completely not the case. Everybody does. It's human nature. And we had started embedding some of the pricing stuff even in our alpha testing a little bit, where we had I don't even remember the price points now, so I'm just going to make it up, but it was $5,000 that we're going to offer to you at 100% off. So we would have an invoice that was $5,000, 100% discount. So it's zero. And it is better to go out with something like that than free, because you are setting an expectation externally and internally of what the value of your thing is. And then you can escalate. So when we went out and did our beta testing and stuff, and I don't remember what the price point was, but it was like this price point and a discount. We were trying, and that was my brother's idea, because that was his brilliance.
The business cap on.
The business cap on. And it really made a difference, and it helped us expand that. And I think a lot of scientists are very hesitant to try and ask people to sell things until they're 100% sure it works or whatever. And some people said no, but enough people said yes. And your market, you're never going to get 100% of everybody, and that's okay. It's also good, your business, your startup, depending upon what it's doing, but you need to convert from a research organization to a sales organization. If you're going biotools or tools or anything that's not regulated, and you need to shift and evolve the mindset of your team internally, in addition to experimenting and connecting with the broader market. And that's helpful and useful to do that and figure out how you develop the right tools and management techniques and cultures and mindsets within the organization to build that sales engine.
All great lessons. And before we move forward, I want to go back to something you mentioned about communicating with the investors. There are a certain group of sophisticated investors where you're able to go and talk and say like, hey, this is not going to work, and they took it the right way. What were the not sophisticated investors looking like? And if there are any lessons approaching investors, what should a founder look for in terms of differentiating the sophisticated versus non-sophisticated investors?
Do your research on investors, and having the right investors can be a huge difference in the potential success of your company, and having the wrong ones, particularly if they end up on your board, can be fatal. There's a lot of lessons here. How much time do we have? One thing to think through, and I've got a bunch of comments here, but just one, at the beginning of your journey, you need 100% of your investors aligned with your vision and on board and supporting you. So that's the embryonic stage. The end of the journey, or an endpoint of many journeys, is an IPO. And if my company's public and I come in, and if on November 17th of 2023, my stock price is at $10.57 a share, what does that mean? Well, that means at that given instant in time, 50% of the investors in my company are betting for it, and 50% of the investors in my company are betting against it. The fair market price is where half are selling and half are buying. And the reality, though, is you have some short sellers, you have some activist investors. So at the end of the journey, the public company founder CEO, on your best days, half of the investors on the planet are betting for you and half are betting against you. You are not making them all happy. That's fair market value. And that journey, you're going to evolve from, I need 100% alignment, to I need to just accept that half of the people are going to hate me on any given day. And understanding that and figuring that out, that you don't always need to make all investors happy all the time, nor can you, is an important thing. You need to figure out the right investors to make happy and listen to at the right time. Another piece of it, and another interesting thing that I've learned from being on the investor side, one of the investment groups I worked with, and it was in private equity, when we were diligencing a company, somebody within the group would choose to disagree with the founder or choose to push back or choose to something. And the topic of what was being disagreed on was not the point of the question or not the point of the exercise. The point of it was to see how the management team responded to that. And having been on a bunch of boards and had a bunch of boards now, you realize the true face of people when the shit hits the fan. If everything's going well, everything's lollipops and rainbows, no problem. When you hit a challenge is where you realize the true nature. So how is that going to happen? How is that going to disagree? And some entrepreneurs, if I ask, well, have you considered X, Y, and Z? And they'll be, oh, you're so brilliant. X, Y, and Z. No, that's not what we want. Tell me, hey, Caleb, I know you'd think X, Y, and Z, but I've thought through this even further than you, and it's stupid. And here's why. And here's what we're going to do. But do that politely, do that transparently, if you've really thought through it. But if you haven't really thought through it, contemplate, oh, well, Caleb, why do you think X and Y? What do you see? Because there's an asymmetry also. Many investors have seen a lot more than many of the founders. And I guess the point I'm trying to make here is the good investors can be your mentors and can provide some insight and are part of your team. And you should not necessarily you should hear and contemplate their advice and suggestions. You should not always take it. A bad investor is the one that if you don't take their advice, they take that personally. There's a handful of companies that I've been invested in that I've offered advice to that luckily they didn't take because my advice turned out to be wrong. And that's a good relationship where it's more that constructive debate or that constructive back and forth to figure out what's ultimately best for the company. And then just one last point on this, then we can go deeper if you want. But what I've found from being on both sides of the table is transparency is valuable. Transparency from an investor's perspective of where they're expecting to go, how much money they will put in, where the dynamics of their decision making. And there's a lot of investors that don't provide that transparency to entrepreneurs and funders. And they're fundamentally wasting your time. You want that transparency. The same way coming from management teams. I've been involved in some companies where it's great. We need a $10 million bridge, or we go out of business in 4 weeks. That's not good. The more seasoned and professional ones are like, it's great. I have some concerns. There's a couple things that could happen. I don't know which way it'll go. This is what I'm thinking. Okay, it didn't really go our way. This is what we're doing. It's a little more challenging. Hey, I need a $10 million bridge. And those ones are more easy to underwrite. So communicating often and early and being transparent about the challenges is valuable. And transparency about the challenges and the failures and what you've done to change it or what you've learned from it is a good way to do that. And if your investors struggle with understanding that not all things in businesses go right all the time, they might not be the right investors.
Thank you for those insights. We'll come back to the investor phase of your life, but I want to go and close up the story on your startup. You're selling product to your beta customers. Where did that lead you to?
That led us to building the technology. That we built the company up a little bit, started to build a little more revenue. And it also led me to the point, and now I'm about 8 years into it, that maybe it's time for Caleb to consider stepping out of the CEO role. So what I was really good at is going from zero to something. We had, where specifically it was to me, and had a conversation with our board, that it's maybe time to find a person to take the next phase. The technology was working. We'd seen it work in a non-human primate study. We were getting some revenue traction. And the next phase to me was, we're going to now turn towards the therapeutic development, like IND submission and those studies, and really growing the revenue. And I was a scientist entrepreneur, maybe a more unique one, but that felt like a whole lot of paper pushing and a whole lot of looking at the EBITDA in the spreadsheet in a market that I was not terribly familiar with. So I thought, somebody can do it better, most likely. Somebody can have more interest in it than I have, and maybe we should start looking for my replacement. So after we'd proven there was some market, proven the technology worked in primates, we went out and spent about a year finding a CEO replacement.
What did you consider? I think you're looking for somebody who can push the papers and actually take the company to the therapeutic side of it. In terms of culture, do you give that freedom for that new CEO to build a new culture, or extend what you build it? I don't know if there's any advice for others to pass on.
This is a very sensitive time in a company's transition. And I've now been an outgoing CEO. I've been the incoming CEO, and I've been on the board and an investor where there have been some CEO transitions. And there are good ways and bad ways to do it. And these can have very huge impacts to the company. In the startup community and in stuff, there's huge survivor bias. And most founders, myself included, when I started, was like, I'm going to run this company for 150 years and I'm going to take it to whatever. And the reality is that there's different phases in a company, and any person, any CEO is also on some development journey. And in the cases, the very, very few cases where the founder, their development and the needs and the stages of the company match, we get these survivor bias stories of Steve Jobs and Elon Musk and stuff. But for the other 99% of companies in the world, there is a phase, and there's times that there's another person that will be better than you at running that company. And for me, with Bell Biosystems, I'm the largest shareholder. And I'm realizing that I'm not the right person for this next stage. So it is in the benefit of my wallet for us to find the person. What do we look for? And the other ones that I've been involved in here too, you look for at that phase when it's a handoff, not a founder stage. You look for somebody that's been around those turns before, so that you can have that expertise be tied into when it's, to use the Teal book, 0 to 1, 1 to N. If you're in that 1 to N stage, you want somebody that's done that before with a very similar product or in a very similar market or very similar scenario, because you're buying the expertise and network at that time. The cultural piece is completely true. That's a very big factor. And in my first transition, I was naive and erroneous, I guess, in thinking that the culture I had created should or could be the culture moving forward afterwards. I don't think that's correct. When you bring in a new CEO, they have their way of operating. They have their culture that they prefer, and they've been around those curves. You need to accept that in the next phase, the company is going to change, and it should hopefully change for the better. If you and the board make the correct decision, it should change for the better. And then the last piece on this that I would say is, this is not a blunt end thing. It should be a baton transfer. You should do this slowly, logically, because with the CEO role, once you hand over the keys to the car, that's it.
And you moved on. Did you have a role in the company at that point still when you passed on the baton? And what was the future looking like?
I stayed on for about a year to help facilitate that transition. And then I went out. Unfortunately, the company about 3 years later filed for bankruptcy. So the transition that we had made for a number of reasons didn't end up being the right one. So I actually then tried to buy the IP back out of bankruptcy. But yeah.
Very sorry about that, unfortunate. But was it more because of the market forces, or is it the technology that wasn't working at that point?
I was out of the driver's seat, so I don't really know. Almost comically, one of the last things that I'd been involved in while I was CEO of the company was to do this primate validation study. The same month I got the notice of the bankruptcy, the publication on the primate study was accepted and went out. So the technology was working. The transition into the market seemed to be more challenging under the new CEO. And he was also unable to raise any money. So I think that was a challenge. And when there's also good timing to do transitions and stuff. And when we effectuated the CEO transition, I closed a financing round. So the last round I did was to really give him the runway. And it was 3-year runway, but there was no additional funding that came into the company after that. So I think that funding was a big challenge. The market, I think, probably played a factor in that, capital markets or the market for the products, but I don't know.
That's fine. Thank you for sharing that last stage of that journey. And the next stage, you ended up at a firm, PE firm?
PE and also VC. And I'd been towards the tail end of my time as CEO, I'd started to get pulled in to help consult on some diligence projects or advise some other companies' portfolios. So it wasn't like, I'm done with this and then I'm going to start that. It was very much a glide path. And I'd been working with these groups for probably 2 or 3 years before really making the, hey, let's this be a more formal jump into it.
Are there any lessons learned in your PE phase of your life, especially when it comes to due diligence? If I'm looking at a founder and PE is looking at my company, what should somebody keep in mind?
The level of due diligence that was done shocked me. I was surprised. I was very surprised at how thorough and how deep and how busy of a job being on the investor side is. As a founder and raising money from investors, it looks like it's easy. It looks like, oh, you just go out and have coffees and talk and do this. And no, the PE fund, it was hundreds of hours of diligence and probably hundreds of thousands to maybe millions of dollars for each one. And the depth and how thorough it was very shocking to me initially to see how deep those dives go.
Is it called for or uncalled for? What were the outcomes of doing so much research? Does it really lead to wins for the PE firms? I never dealt with the PE firms, so this is complete ignorance on my side.
I spent about a year at PE and then realized I'm more of an early stage guy, which given the conversation about my CEO transition and stuff, he probably could have figured that out already. It took me a year to refigure out the same lesson. But private equity and venture is different. We did a buyout deal with the PE fund, and I've done seed funding. I've done Series A, Series B, Series C's. I've done a lot. And the level of diligence that is appropriate for the company is dependent upon the stage and the size of the check you're writing. So private equity is on the far end. They do all the way down the rabbit hole. And I think for me, at least, it was really interesting to see that, see how much they look at, how thorough it is, and how you on the other side can make their job easy by setting it up well and being supportive. On the venture side, the level of diligence is very different. It's a little bit lower, but it scales with how much money are we investing in this company and what stage is the company.
Talk about you becoming a venture capitalist, about the decision-making process in your brain. Did you want to go back and start a company at that point? Or how did you make a decision that you wanted to become an investor?
it wasn't really a decision. It was like an evolution, and I got pulled in, and then these firms offered me roles. And I think it's the investors that have also been operators. It's almost like a superpower in a way. The big piece of the superpower is you can empathize with the founders. You understand how many frogs they're kissing to try and get their funding closed. You understand the challenges that they may be facing in the business, and maybe you can offer some support to help them navigate it. You also, from the investor side, and when you're diligencing things, you can understand the bullshit that people are selling and where some of the skeletons might be buried. And you look at different things. I'll give you one that I look at. Depending upon the phase of the company, are the founders budgeting to be flying first class everywhere? Are they budgeting to be staying in Ritz-Carltons and Four Seasons or Airbnbs? And depending upon what it is, we're not talking about big numbers. Yeah. So it's not a question of the amount, but it's the mindset and how do they organize things and stuff. So I think back to answering your question, the firms, the groups that I were working with, were looking for some people with some operational experience to help with the due diligence and also to help support the portfolio companies. And what I find most fun is being able to help with the portfolio companies. If there's a way, I was an operator for almost 20 years across a bunch of different businesses. I got a lot of scars. I made a lot of mistakes and I've learned from them. And if there's a way that I can have any one of those mistakes help some other founder avoid something, there's a really unique type of satisfaction that comes from that, of being able to help somebody. And I think part of that satisfaction comes from the fact that I've had so many good mentors myself that have helped me. I enjoy that part of being an investor. Not all the companies that I've worked with have heeded my advice. And in some cases, they've been right. And in some cases, I've been right. And in many cases, neither of us have been right. So it's a little painful if you have a founder that really doesn't know what they don't know and aren't willing to take some coaching. And it's really a pleasure for the ones, whether they take your advice or not, that at least heed it and are cognizant of what they don't know.
Super important. Self-realization, I think that's something every entrepreneur should have. In your case, you decide that I'm not the right CEO at this point, I need to move on. But I want to go back to something you mentioned about empathy. I was talking to Doug Crawford on my show, and he talked about how venture capitalists don't have a heart. And here you are, a founder with emotional large heart, trying to become a venture capitalist. Do you have a tough time?
That's interesting because Doug Crawford is a VC.
He mentioned it. He said like that.
There are a handful of investors and VCs that don't. And I've had the displeasure of working with some of them. And then there's some others that really do. And there's some founders in the world that are amazing, altruistic people. And there's other ones that are charlatans. There's rotten apples in every bucket, but finding a rotten apple doesn't make the bucket rotten. And I think one of my lead investors, a really great guy, Dick Sanguinian, I asked him once, and he was 80, he was an amazing guy. I asked him, what's your secret? And he said, I just don't do business with people I don't like. That was it. He's like, we want to make money, we want to do stuff, but if I don't like or get along with you, find somebody else. And there are enough, and this is hard as an entrepreneur when you're trying, how the hell do I get my money? I need it anywhere. But really, you do have choices. Really, you can, and you can pick and choose who you're working with. And as the older I get, I want to work with people that I like working with and people that share the values. Not all VCs are heartless. There's a lot that are there, particularly the early stage guys, because the earlier stage, there's so many things that don't work out, and you're making a bet in the absence of it making sense. When you look at and you underwrite an investment, there's some leap of faith. This does not all come together, but I believe this team can get over this chasm. And you have to come to that leap of faith. And that takes a certain type of person. If you're pure Wall Street, if you're doing some restructurings, maybe Doug's comment's right. But I think in the early stage, there's a lot of really good people out there.
Absolutely. I had the pleasure of talking to many of them. I know we don't have too much time, but before we close, I want to make sure we understand your investment thesis at your present firm, Corundum Systems Biology. If a founder is trying to approach you, any advice for them?
Corundum is really, really interesting in that in addition to early stage venture investments, we also do sponsored research grants. So within the Corundum group, we actually just created Corundum Convergence Institute. It's a 501c3 nonprofit that does pure sponsored research grants. I've been working with this group for a little over 2 years. It's fantastic because we're not purely return minded. We have 2 buckets of capital, one that we expect some return and one that is 100% guaranteed not to give a return. So that's really interesting. We have within the Corundum group, and I sit formally within Corundum Systems Biology and also on Corundum Convergence Institute, that nonprofit. Corundum Systems Biology is focused on microbiome and microbiome adjacent technologies. We have a sister fund called Corundum Neuroscience that's focused on neuroscience and those technologies. That is headquartered in Israel. Corundum Systems Biology is headquartered in Tokyo. And then within the Corundum Convergence Institute, we also are focused on AI. Back to your how do people approach us? So we have those 3 areas of interest: neuro, systems biology, microbiology, and AI. We have a lot of technical folks on the team, so we go very deep in the science on these things. We can come in very early, even pre-company. We do sponsored research. And the way to approach this is just approach. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can probably find my email from some Google searches, or you can come up to me. We look very deeply at the science and we look very deeply at the people. We're fundamentally a Japanese fund, very relationship based. We only want to do business with people we like and trust. And we have a pretty fantastic portfolio of companies so far. And we also want to add value just beyond the money. And as I mentioned before, not all of our money is looking for a return, which is a very interesting and unique situation to be in.
Great. Now on to my traditional closing questions. The first one, if there's 1 or 2 mistakes that you have founders avoid if they can, what would that be?
These are maybe some pet peeves too. There is insane information asymmetry. As a partner at a venture fund, I usually look at anywhere from 300 to 500 deals a year. The moment you say, we're the only one that does X, nobody else is doing this, make sure that's really true, because you'll lose a little credibility. And there's a lot of companies that are in stealth mode. There's a lot of things that are popping up every day. So saying we're the only is challenging unless you're confident of it. The other thing I would say is be prepared for the due diligence and help. It doesn't have to be painful. We're trying to get to understand you and your company. And we also want to know the challenges. Every company has some challenges or some things that don't lie up. We want to help you navigate through those. So we're looking for teams and people that are sophisticated enough and mature enough emotionally to be like, this is the gap and this is our strategy to get across it, or this is the gap and that's why our milestones for this fundraising round are aimed at addressing that. The venture capital game is absolutely one of risk and reward. If there's no risk, if this company has no risks, if we ask you the question and say, what risks are you worried about? And the only one you can come up with is financial, then that's a little bit scary. Then what are we investing in? If there's no risk, there's no reward. So being transparent about that, maybe not on the first conversation. Keep it high level and smiles and lollipops. But as we get deeper in, being open and transparent and cognizant of where the gaps or the rough edges are.
Great advice. And the second one is, if you want to acknowledge 1 or 2 people in each stage of your life that really help you. I think mentors play a big role, friends play a big role, family plays a big role. I ask this question because they are important.
They are. And I think be really true and have high ethics. And I look back and I've founded a bunch of companies and I've had investors that have lost money in one company and then invested in my next one. And when that first happened, I asked them, I was like, why? That surprised me. And it was because they trust it. And investors that are sophisticated or have been here for a long time understand how there's ebbs and flows and ups and downs. And at least for me in my life, I've learned far more from my mistakes than my successes. And sometimes you want somebody that's been through some. So having those good friends and families and treating those relationships, treasuring those relationships, I think is really valuable. We create companies, we create organizations, we create countries in this world, and we have some piece of paper or some treaty or some lines that are on a map. And those are all arbitrary. Those are made up. Those are fake. What a company, an organization, or a country really is a collection of people that have agreed to be bound by some code of ethics, bound by some vision, and focus on something. And those people can expand beyond one company, beyond one country, beyond one boundary. And if we as human beings are able to do that well, we can do some amazing things. We put up these fake walls and these competition, and I like competition for a lot of reasons, but we can do that to a detriment and a negative of advancing innovation and helping people and society and this planet benefit.
Caleb, that was great. Thank you so much. I think I can have this conversation for another few hours, but because of the time, I'm actually forcefully shutting down this conversation. But I would love to have you again. I think there's so many topics I would still love to talk, but thank you so much for your time and advice.
Thank you for the time. It was an honor. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Lab to Startup podcast. You can find links to the resources and programs mentioned in these episodes, connect with Naresh, or subscribe to this show at labtostartup.com.